Well, welcome. Welcome to this Innovation Forum live podcast. I'm Ian Welsh. But anyway, welcome. Today I'm joined by Siegfried Knecht, who's CEO of the Aviation Institute for Renewable Energy in Germany, known as AREG. Welcome, Siegfried. I'll come to Siegfried in a second. We're keen to hear from everybody on the call. So if you want to engage with us, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom window. Put your questions in there. Like other questions, and I will put them to Siegfried a little bit later on. We're running for 30 minutes today. So we're going to talk about sustainable aviation fuels. Welcome, Siegfried.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian. Hello, everyone. And thanks for inviting me to this event today.
Thank you. Well, no, thank you. Our pleasure. So, Siegfried, how do we define sustainable aviation fuels then?
Well, simply saying, sustainable aviation fuels are renewable waste-derived or renewable power-derived fuels for aircraft that significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions compared to conventional jet fuel. So they can be produced. They can be produced from sustainable feedstocks, like you may have heard of that. Use cooking oil, municipal solid state waste, agriculture or woody residues, or even from low carbon power sources, which we in Germany like to call green power sources or green hydrogen. So SAF can be blended with fossil jet fuel up to 50% and used in current aircraft engines without any modification, and also without any modification at airports. So it can just be used, but only up to that blending percentage. Important to know, they are chemically similar to fossil jet fuel and must adhere to strict international standards. That's what SAFs are about.
Okay, so how big is the sustainable air fuel market at the moment?
Well, production, so to speak, doubled last year to around 1 million tons. And for example, according to the RefuelEU regulation, they must reach at least 3 million tons in 2030, which is the 6% mandate in the EU with a 1.2% ESAF sub-mandate. So from an EU perspective, the requirement in 2030, from my point of view, can be met. But globally, with a forecasted demand of around 40 million tons by 2035, the likelihood of a gap, be it 20, 25, or even less, so that production gap seems to be rising. This is according to a recent forecast by a Dutch organization called Sky Energy. On the other hand, which is not, let's say, to the contrary, but there is a think tank in Germany called CENA, C-E-N-A. They are an AREG member as well. Production capacity can go up to more than 30 million tons by 2030. All the announcements which are currently out there are being accomplished. So whatever the production increase will be, the majority will happen in the USA and in Asia. And for comparison, today roughly 300 million tons of Jet A1 are used globally, and that figure will rise to about 500 million tons by 2050. So as you can see, there is still a huge gap between what is needed, but I'm optimistic, I'm convinced that by 2050, maybe not 100% of the fossil jet can be replaced, but at least a significant amount.
Okay, and what do you give, or what's the basis for that? I mean, just recently, the CEO of Ryanair said that he felt that sustainable aviation fuels would never reach that kind of level of capacity.
Well, I think it can be reached. You know, according to a recent IATA study, there is, or the likelihood that that amount can be reached is rather sure. So the raw material or the feedstock, that's not the bottleneck. So there is enough feedstock out there. And apart from renewable power, renewable hydrogen, and biogenic CO2, there is enough feedstock in the US, in Asia, to comply with the figure which I just mentioned. The bottleneck is rather the investment confidence in production plants, which is missing today. And in the end, it all depends. And as you were mentioning Ryanair, in the end, it all depends on offtake agreements to which airlines are invited.
Okay, thank you. Let's come back to some of that in a sec. You mentioned regulation. What are the current regulatory requirements worldwide for sustainable aviation fuels?
Well, on the one hand, that's what I mentioned. That's the Refuel EU regulation in Europe or in the European Union. And on the other hand, I think it was last year when at ICAO, it was agreed that by 2030, 5% of the emissions should be reduced. What we see is regulation popping up globally, not that much in the US because the US is rather favoring incentives, but in other parts of the world, in Asia specifically, but also in the UK, for example, there is regulation popping up. Maybe not as compulsory or as strict as it is in the EU, but there is more and more mandates coming in.
Great. Okay. So you mentioned earlier potential. So you're saying that potentially sustainable aviation fuels could power all aircraft. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. Up to 50% today, but Airbus as well as Boeing are working for a 100% drop-in solution, which should be ready by 2030. By the way, and again, as I said, not only the IATA study, but also other, let's say, reports, for example, by the Department of Energy in the US, they are claiming that there is enough feedstock out there to replace fossil jet by SAF in 2050.
Okay. Your organization operates in Germany. Can you give us a quick snapshot of the market there?
Well, honestly speaking, there is almost no market in Germany because there is only little production in my country. There is no bio-SAF production at all. Of course, there are companies like DHL and some smaller ones which are using SAF, but that's all being imported. So again, there is no production as of today. There are some smaller eSAF or power to liquid SAF facilities in Germany which started production recently. Well, the good news is that a HEFA plant is in a concrete planning phase in the northern part of Germany, specifically in Hamburg. As far as eSAF projects are concerned, will most likely be two which will receive substantial public funding. In the end, if this all happens, what I was just saying as planned, then by 2030, like some 250 to 300,000 tons might be available in Germany, which of course is still a rather, should I say, low figure compared to the 10 million tons of kerosene being used annually in Germany. Anyway, with those figures, at least, the mandates, the EU mandates can be met in 2030.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you also to those of you who put questions into the Q&A box. We'll come to those shortly. And apologies again for my slightly glitchy video. So you've talked about some of these already, Siegfried, but can you perhaps just outline the barriers to growth of sustainable aviation fuels at the moment?
Well, as I said, stocks or raw materials, that's not the barrier. The barriers are in a rather unreliable regulation, at least in the EU. Today we have this Refuel EU regulation. We have the Renewable Energy Directive Revision 3, but built in there is already a review process, which will happen in 27, 28. And so that's not a reliable scheme. Investors, as you all know, they look rather for 15 to 20, if not 25 years for their investment. And so what is ultimately needed is a reliable regulation for investors on the one hand side. Secondly, this should be seconded, at least from my point of view, also by public funding. None of the plants needed will be funded with 100%, but at least some public funding from governments in the EU must be provided. And what I also mentioned already, there is a lack of offtake agreements by airlines. Of course, they are claiming the first plants, they will produce stuff which is far too expensive, and perhaps the second, the third one, then the production costs will be lowered. But again, without offtake agreements, process will not be successful. So it's three things. It's regulation, it's public funding, and it's offtake agreements as a prerequisite for investments.
Okay, let's talk a bit about price briefly then, what is the, and this is a question that's come from our audience, what is the current premium price for sustainable aviation fuels right now?
Well, as the audience probably knows, the SAF which is being provided today is HEFA, so produced from used cooking oil, and the latest figure I saw were around 12, 13, up to 1,500 euros. If you compare this to the current fossil jet price, which is around 700, so it's a factor of two compared to fossil jet. That's for the biogenic pathways. Let's put it like this. For ESAF, there is no production. What EASA did, what the audience probably also knows, they sort of tried, to set a price in order to also define the penalties which would have to be paid by producers, but also by airlines if the mandates cannot be met. So the price for ESAF is above 7,000 euros per ton. I don't think that's something which will indeed be the price in the end of the first plants, which are at the horizon. But nobody knows, in the end what the production costs will be, because they are much dependent on the costs of the feedstock of the hydrogen, but also of the biogenic CO2. I would expect it being lower, but I can only, look into the glass ball and guess some things. Nobody knows how this may be in the end.
I know you say it's a crystal ball time, but I mean, what's the best guess then in terms of forecasting for costs for 2030? It's a question from our audience again. What is the best guess in terms of 2030 forecasting price?
Well, to put it that way, SAF will also always be more expensive than fossil jet. So whether it's, for the biogenic pathways, I would expect it being a factor of 2. For ESAF, it would rather be a factor of 5, 6, if not 8 in the end. However, specifically airlines are always arguing with those dramatic figures. If you bring it down to what the extra cost per seat or per passenger in an aircraft, be it an Airbus A320 or a Boeing 737, it's not that much. For example, for the 6% mandate in 2030, the extra cost per pax for, let's say, short to medium haul flights would be something like 3, 4, 5 euros per pax, which, at least from my perspective, is affordable. When it comes to ESAF, again, nobody knows what the price in the end will be. But of course, even for the short and medium haul flights, it will be in the order of 10 to 15 euros per passenger. Of course, if you consider, let's say, flights from Munich to the US or from Munich to Singapore, and this may go up to, I don't know, 25 to 30 or even 40 euros per passenger. Of course, that's not nothing, but if we all strive for a blue planet, I think passengers should be integrated in that discussion and be, should I say, educated to be ready, to bear the extra cost.
Okay, let's talk about feedstocks now. You've mentioned these again, some of these already, but just run us through the key feedstocks for sustainable aviation fuels.
Well, today the key feedstock is used cooking oil. Then there are a couple of projects following the alcohol to jet pathway. So coming from sugars or lignocellulosic feedstocks, you can use the A to J pathway to produce SAF. There was always a discussion if algae, could be a feedstock which could contribute to reducing aviation's climate impact. There was a hype about 10 to 15 years ago that then, diminished because it turned out that the energy costs are far too high. So it's again getting a bit of a dynamic. So I'm keen to learn next week at the algae biomass summit in Phoenix, if there is again a potential with that feedstock. So there is a lot, as I mentioned already, a lot of agricultural woody biomass available globally. But of course the technologies are rather mature, but you have to have big production plants in order to bring the costs down if you scale the size of the production. So that's sort of what is in the making today. And I'm sure we will see within the next couple of years, new technologies are arising. But the big hurdle is always, standardization. As I said, SAFs have to follow strict international standards. And there is a body, that is the ASTM in the US, which is taking care of all this. And the process, to get this qualified and certified is of course a barrier, because you have to produce not only a few liters but a few tons in order to allow the aircraft manufacturers but also the engine OEMs to make sure that the product which is being used in the engine, in the aircraft, is safe, because safety is the number one priority in aviation.
Okay. Something that's mentioned frequently is the risks of competition between growing food and feedstocks for sustainable aviation fuels. Is that something you are concerned about, or can we reach the sort of levels of sustainable aviation fuel use that you've been talking about without taking over land that's currently used for food?
Of course, this was a huge debate during the last couple of years, if not decades, specifically also in my country. But I can only um, say this from an AREC perspective. From an AREC perspective, there is no competition at all, simply because we in AREC, as we are in the EU, we are supporting or favoring only feedstocks for advanced biofuels, which are compliant with this famous Annex 9 of the RED. So there is a regulation, what is being allowed for advanced biofuels and whatnot. And so as we follow this, I don't see a competition with food and feed. Well, this probably is being seen differently in Asia or in the USA. But again, we are living, or we have to live, with the regulation in the EU, which is very good from my personal perspective also. So we have to comply with the EU regulation, and from this, I don't see any competition, even if NGOs are still claiming the opposite. But again, we are following the regulation, and with this, I don't see a real problem here.
We have a question asking if there's a risk that collectively we run out of the waste from oils, the woody residues that you've mentioned, before we have enough to make sustainable aviation fuel for all aircraft. Is that a risk you're concerned about?
Well, there is a risk that we're running out of used cooking oil, but there is so much other feedstock available. Again, billions of tons of agricultural and woody residues which are available globally. So, and from that perspective, I don't see us running out of feedstock. Again, UCO is probably coming to an end by maybe 2035 or even 2040. That's sort of the time frame. But given all the other feedstocks, of course, we have to build plants which are using that feedstock. But I'm hopeful that this will be accomplished within the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay. How do you deal with the problem of competition for the feedstock? Because obviously there are other transportation methods that are competing for the use of feedstock. I mean, you can make biodiesel for trucks, for example. How do you see that kind of competition playing out?
Of course, there is competition. The report I mentioned, this famous billion-ton report in the USA, claiming that there is 1.6, if not 1.8 billion tons of feedstock available to produce biodiesel, bioethanol, but also SAF. But at least it is being said there that this would be sufficient, to comply with the demand needed in the USA. Sort of different in the EU with the progressing electrification in road transport. I believe, that competition will be reduced. But of course, there are associations, there are companies which are already claiming not all the feedstock they can also use should go towards the use in aviation. But again, with the with the growing electrification, at least in Europe, I see that competition diminishing.
Okay, thank you. So you mentioned earlier standardization. What are the relevant certifications and standards then for sustainable aviation fuel?
Well, there is a specific standard defined by the ASTM, which has to follow the specifications of Jet A1. So, as I said, Jet A1 and SAF have to be chemically similar. There are, I don't know how many values, maybe 10 or 8, which have to be again similar to what is being defined for Jet A1. And if this can be demonstrated by those bringing in new SAFs, they will receive the corresponding qualification. That's how it goes. It can be a lengthy process. It could take up to 3 to 4 years. For example, considering the renewable power pathway, there is one pathway which is the Fischer-Tropsch pathway, which is already qualified and certified. The other one, the methanol to jet pathway, is being discussed and reviewed by ASTM. I think at least for the last 2 to 3 years. They're still not there yet. But there is on the other hand, there is also sort of a fast track mechanism which could speed up that process. But anyway, it takes in the end 2 to 3 years, to come up with a safe new SAF.
Okay, I'm conscious that we're coming towards the end of our time. How do you think then, in closing, that the market will evolve over the coming decade?
Well, I think I already mentioned, and I'm convinced net zero by 2050 can be achieved, which means replacing fossil Jet A1 completely with SAF. The ingredients, again, a reliable SAF production ramp up globally based on the available feedstocks, combined with clear and reliable regulation, public funding, and massive investments with offtake agreements as the most important prerequisite. So, in a nutshell, all stakeholders must engage, including the passenger, as I already said, and strive towards the 2050 goal. So, if you look to the other side, to the other side of the Atlantic, and despite the fact that the current administration probably sees things differently, there is still the SAF Grand Challenge in place, aiming at an availability of 3 billion gallons by 2030 and 35 billion gallons in 2050. So, from that perspective, and looking towards the east, towards Asia, what is happening there in China, in Indonesia, India, in the Asia Pacific region, I'm confident, as I said already, that the goal can be met. And if I may, I'd like to end with a quote of Senator Ted Kennedy, who said at the end of his campaign speech in 1980, "The work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die." Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you, Siegfried. Well, yes, brought things to a close now. We've reached time. We will, of course, we have been recording this podcast, so we will send it out as a podcast shortly on the Innovation Forum podcast channel. The conversation we're having today will be reflected in our event coming up on the 16th and 17th of April 2026 in Amsterdam. So do get in touch for more information on that, our Energy Transition Innovation Forum. And also do join us in an hour for the next of our Future of Fuels live podcast, when we'll be looking at hydrogen. But for now, I'm Renewable Welsh. Siegfried, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and have a good day. Bye-bye.